Hey there, gang. We're dipping back into the 1940s for this one. This is an old school Epiphone. People have been thinking about Epiphone as a budget brand since probably the early 1970s when Gibson decided to send its production overseas. But Epiphone was around for a very long time before Gibson bought it, and their instruments were on par, if not better, than a lot of comparable Gibson products of the era. This is a Blackstone made in 1946 in New York City. New York City! This model was in production with various changes from the early 30s into the early 50s. They started off with smaller bodies and gradually followed the trend for jazz guitars and got a little bit bigger every few years. This one is over 16 inches at the lower bout. They have a 25.5-inch scale, 1.75-inch nut width. Pretty nice necks on them. Good solid spruce tops, laminated maple back and sides. I guess the Gibson equivalent would be an L48 or an L50, in that range. So the Epi in Epiphone stands for Epaminondas Stathopoulos, who took over his father's instrument making shop, which had been in New York City since 1908. His dad, Anastasios, had been building since the 1870s over in Greece. I guess it was the Ottoman Empire at that point. But he immigrated to the U.S., started up the workshop. Epi took over in 1928. They kept building under this name. He passed away in the 40s, and then they continued on for another 10 years or so. In 1957, Gibson bought out the company, and it became a strange, I don't know how we would typify it. It's not really a budget brand. They had a lot of models that were almost identical except for branding for, the better part of the 1960s, at which point they moved their production to Japan and subsequently Korea, China. And so now it occupies an interesting space. It's kind of the learner's model or the budget line. But they've made some really good stuff over the years. Anyway, so there's this strange bifurcated history of it. There's pre-Gibson Epiphone and post-Gibson Epiphone. This guitar's had some additions over the years. The tuners were switched. It's got Grovers on it right now. The owner would like to go with something a little bit more period appropriate. This trapeze tailpiece has been switched over. It's not unlike the original one, but this one is gold plated. These would originally have had nickel. And then there is a Bartolini floating pickup here, as well as a piezo bridge that's got an insert, which is not original either. The action on this is too low. It's about a 32nd of an inch on the bass side, and even lower on the treble. It's buzzing all along the fretboard. And of course the owner is not keen on this bridge here. This is anachronistic, doesn't look original. It's just, it's not holding the strings at the right height, and he wants something that looks better, so we're going to make a new bridge for him. He wants to keep the neck pickup though. This is apparently a pretty good pickup. I know Bob Benedetto was using these in some of his guitars for a long time, so it's going to be a super clean, dark, New York jazz club kind of sound. Yeah, we're going to make a traditional archtop bridge for this today. There's a crack moving down from the F hole here. This is a pretty common place for them to occur, so we'll glue that up and put in a cleat or two. The nut seems to have some ugly shims. There are a couple of low slots, and the side of the nut on the treble side is cracked off. You can't see it because it's kind of washed out, but it's there, it's broken. And lastly, in the "if you can do something about this, please do it" category, the binding on the neck is split around the side dots, and it's kind of strange looking, sort of distracting. Maybe we can fill that with something and give it a cleaner look. Let's check and see if the electronics are working. There are two. Wow. So there's one volume and one tone control. Very touchy. Let's investigate the bridge. The wire comes out through the center. There's a rosewood shim. And actually there's another one glued to the base, so obviously it wasn't tall enough, or maybe the top dips during the winter when it gets dry. The saddle is in 2 pieces, and that appears to be deliberate. I think it was made that way to separate the base from the treble. The ends appear to be intentional. They're clean, they're not broken. I thought again that maybe this was a commercial product. Like, it triggers a memory, like I'd seen it someplace before, maybe an old StewMac catalog or something. I couldn't find it online. Maybe I dreamed it. This tailpiece here has been modified. There's a semicircular cutout to accommodate the end pin jack, which is a pretty elegant solution. Let's disengage the bracket here. And we can see that there is some vintage duct tape. It's turned all sticky. Pretty simple electronics. So I'll go ahead and remove the bridge pickup lead. I think to keep those cables captured, I should capture them with a cable tie. The pick guard is held onto the neck with a small steel bracket using a nut and a bolt, which were very fun to position. And the bolt happens to be a Robertson No. 1 drive, so you know this was done by some hoser. The owner brought me some Golden Age relict tuners, which are much too small for these retrofitted holes, and so are the bushings for the front sides, so we're going to have to plug these. To clean up the holes in preparation for the plugs, I'll ream them out using a drill bit, but it's turning backwards, so it's less likely to tear things up. I'll make the plugs with a 3/8 inch plug cutter. Put a little glue, and that should do it. We'll saw those off with this tiny flush cutting saw. I'm protecting the delicate face of the headstock with this piece of plastic here. It's only a few thousandths of an inch thick. Despite appearances, using a chisel with a big, flat, wide blade like this helps register against the surface of the headstock, and because I'm holding it on the flat side of the blade, it's less likely to dip in and cause damage to the surface. Yeah, I know it takes some nerve, but it's okay. Don't worry, I've done this before. I plugged up some of the numerous screw holes from tuners past and touched them up with some marker. I can't believe I lost the footage of me re-drilling these holes. It was a delicate balancing act on my drill press table, using a brad point bit to keep things centered. Here I'm reaming them to the final diameter for the bushings, which should be a nice press fit. Inspecting the crack at the F-hole. This is a reinforcement of glue-soaked linen, which is a very old practice extending back into the violin world. This one cracked right through. Gluing this crack up might not be that easy, because it looks like someone has previously tried to glue it using super glue. Here's the spot where they accidentally glued their finger to the top, and then they of course wiped it across the surface in a panic, like, ah! You know, that kind of thing. That means that this wood is basically sealed off and it doesn't really want to accept water-based glues all that well. I'm going to try and sand very lightly, see if we can break some of that coating and make it more amenable to an adhesive. Glue up proceeds in my usual fashion. I get a good lake of the stuff on the surface there and then pump it through using a small suction cup to force it through to the other side. I can also push the loose portion of the plate upwards and downwards a bit too to exercise the glue. Wipe off most of the excess, and then nearly break my little finger trying to get the magnet into the right position. I'll apply my homemade cross-body clamp here, check to make sure that things are reasonably level, which they are. Later I'll come back with a cleat. I position this using a length of bent and sharpened coat hanger. I hold that in place for a minute or so the glue has time to grab. Before starting work on the new bridge, I have to check and see what the projected height of it should be. Turns out it's around 21 millimeters. I didn't like that little hole in the top, so I decided to patch it with a piece of spruce. I'll come back later and pare that off clean. And then I can prepare some ebony blanks for both the top and bottom portion of the bridge. Careful layout is important here, because I have to drill both parts and the little holes have to line up. Checking the diameter of the pins which I'll use for the adjustment mechanism. And drill those out on the drill press. The bottom of the previous bridge fit the top pretty well, so I decided to use that as a template. I marked that out and cut it off on the bandsaw, and also made a small, tighter radius arch in the center, which is a feature you find on quite a lot of bridges from the 40s and 50s. I put a strip of tape on the top and super glued some sandpaper to it. Then it was just a matter of sanding to mark the high spots and stopping every once in a while to remove them with a scraper. This takes quite a long time. Longer than you might imagine. I think I was doing this for the better part of half an hour. Eventually, though, I end up with a nice fit. There are several ways to resolve the ends of the bridge base. I marked the edge of the wheels here and then used the spindle sander to make a shape I've seen in several historical examples. And then there's some hand filing and sanding to refine it. I used a radius sanding block to make the arch for the top of the saddle portion. This is all very similar to that Harmony bridge I made last month. Same technique. I wish I'd saved the routing jig I'd made for that. Just kidding. It probably wouldn't have worked for this one. That's why I make them all quick and ugly, because these are all custom, and they vary slightly from each other. They're not all the same. And they don't take long to make, and that's why I have a bunch of these useful plywood scraps hanging around. I talked to the customer about what he wanted to do for the tailpiece and jack situation. He wanted to avoid putting even more holes in the guitar, so it was decided to replicate this one. Of course, one of the screws in the jack was just irretrievably stripped. I got lucky in that even though the pattern on these tailpieces were slightly different, the screw holes lined up exactly. I needed to pull the jack away from the body slightly so I could fit the new tailpiece behind it and make a tracing. It was very snug in its hole. Had to use the soft jaw pliers. Then, using the scribe, I transferred the shape. That's satisfying. Then I hacked off most of the waste using the jeweler's saw before sanding the radius with the drum sander. The result was pretty clean. It doesn't look very much out of place, and I was happy with it. There were loose areas of binding alongside each of the cracked dot holes. I held them down in place and got some thin super glue in there. I was thinking about what I was going to do for these. Replacing the entire length of binding is very tricky in a case like this where the edge is worn and the frets extend over it. I've done this with melted nitrocellulose before, but the color never really matched up, especially on like an old example like this. So I thought I'd try something new and go with epoxy putty and see if I can tint it afterwards. So this is a two-part mixture. It's got both putty and hardener in one stick. You knead it vigorously, make sure that it's well mixed up, and then you've got about 5 minutes in which to force it into the crack. It's got the consistency of like plasticine or modeling clay, so it's pretty easy to work with. So I shoved it in all the little cracks and the holes and then let it dry. It takes about a couple of hours before it gets really good and hard, and then I can file off the excess on the edges and also remove any excess super glue using a razor blade. The color is a creamy kind of grayish white which isn't a perfect match, but I thought I could do something about that. So I used some modeling enamel paint here. It's thinned, and I've mixed up some yellow and white here to give me something that's a little bit closer in color to the rest of the binding. The epoxy putty sucks it in pretty well. The surface is kind of dry to start with, and it readily accepts the paint. I debated trying to save the old nut, but there's just too many things wrong with it. It's broken in several areas, and it's got these shims under there, so I decided to make a new one of the correct height. I think I've shown how to make a nut enough times this year already. When the enamel was dry, I could come back and use the small jeweler's drill here and excavate for the new side dots. This is another operation I seem to do almost weekly these days. There's only so many ways I can film this. Back to the bridge base, I can install the posts for real this time, using a little bit of super glue in the hole as well. And then come back with small scrapers and really refine the top surface here. I've already marked out the string spacing. There's still some intonation work to do once I've got it strung up. Ebony takes an exceptionally good polish. You can work it right up to 12,000 grit micro mesh and it'll gleam. At that point it almost looks like plastic. So I usually stop at around 3,200 or 4,000 grit. Once I found the place where it intonated the best, I marked it off, took the bridge off again, and inserted 2 small steel pins so that the position will remain constant. And so we come to the end of another one. This is a lovely guitar. It's got a very characteristic 1940s archtop sound to it. It's not the most refined thing, but it's very expressive. It's very fun to play. So I'll do both acoustic and then turn on the pickup so you can hear what that sounds like as well.